Okay, let's do a quick review here of this unit of global empires at war. The goal here for you being able to do is to explain how problems and pressures within systems led to conflict and instability all across the Unit 11, and be able to evaluate which factors, right, leaders, systems, or ideas best explain why these conflicts happened. Big pattern of this unit, right? Systems try to create order. We see this over and over again. The reason we have governments, the reason we have pretty much any structure is to create order out of chaos in our world. But pressure builds over time when that order has some vulnerability baked in or when new crises hit. Leaders have to make decisions inside those systems that have already been created, and this results in either conflict or collapse within that system. The key idea to remember here from this unit is most conflicts are not caused by a single event. It's multiple things happening, interacting, that create this conflict that we studied throughout this semester. Case in point, let's talk about Napoleon, right? There was a real problem with Napoleon. There was political instability in France after the revolution. There was mass chaos, the reign of terror, right? Other countries, other kingdoms, emperors coming in and attacking the French people. So there was a problem. This created pressure, a need for order, both within France, but also outside of it, as these outside empires were pushing in on French borders. This led to a choice the people had to make. They could either continue on with their revolutionary governments, or they could create a strong centralized rule that could then handle, at least in their minds, the problems created by the pressure they saw building up from the revolution. This leads to the consequence, right? Overexpansion, resistance to that overexpansion from the government, and eventual collapse of Napoleon's empire. The big takeaway from Napoleon is that strong leaders can create short-term stability, but they'll also lead to long-term problems, as we will see as we get to World War II and the rise of the fascist movements. Industrialization is another example of this, right? The problem is industrialization leads to inequality, as there are people who are getting really, really rich and people who are staying very, very, very poor. And also the working conditions in these factories were terrible, as we saw. This led to pressure because workers were becoming much, much more frustrated as their bellies were empty and their minds were definitely not distracted. Remember that old adage I keep reminding you of, as long as people's bellies are full and minds are distracted, they will not rise up against you. But because their bellies were empty and their minds were clearly not distracted, they were frustrated and were beginning to rise up. This led to a choice. People began to join protest movements, organize unions, and new ideas were developed to challenge the systems that were in place. This is where we get the ideas of Karl Marx, socialism, and communism, which, remember, are two different things. All right, go back to your notes on industrialization, go back to our readings on that to review the difference between those. Now, the consequence of this is it led to increased conflict between workers and the owners of the industrial factories, as we saw, right? And the Bayview Massacre was a great example of this. The takeaway here is that economic systems put into place to decide how resources are distributed in society, can lead to social tension when those resources are divided up in a way that the people see as unfair. Imperialism is another example of this, right? Countries going out and conquering other countries. Now, this led to this became from a problem. These empires needed resources for their factories, and they needed markets to sell those products to. And so they went out and they conquered other areas to get those resources and get those markets. This led to pressure as these different empires became in competition with each other in order to gain the most resources and the most markets, to produce the most wealth, to have the most power. This led to a choice. One of the last areas of the world they had not yet divided up was Africa, and this led to the scramble for Africa. Go back to those notes and those readings to really understand what was going on there. The consequence of this was increased global tension and resistance against imperialization. Right, resistance we saw with Menelik II over in Ethiopia, increased global tensions, as we saw when we referenced the Opium Wars between the British and the Chinese. And so, again, the takeaway, competition between nations is creating instability in the world as each nation and their empires are trying to one-up each other, essentially. This then culminated in World War I, right? There was a rising tension in Europe as all these empires were in competition with each other. We saw the pressure from mania. Again, I like to throw that extra I in here. I know mania is spelled M-A-N-I-A, but I like to throw an extra I in there because I think industrialization does play a pretty big role in this, right? So the pressures created by militarism, alliances, industrialization, nationalism, imperialism, and then the final assassination, which was the trigger, right? The thing that sparked this whole war, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne of Austria-Hungary, and that kind of led to all of this exploding. The consequence was war on a global scale because of imperialism, because of nationalism, because of alliances, and all these things we've been talking about. And this was also played out in trench warfare, in which we spent an entire day seeing what that was like. The takeaway here was that long-term causes, right, imperialism, alliances, nationalism, industrialization, these are things that have been building for a long time in the world, right? They're long-term causes that then added up into a single trigger, the assassination, that led to mass conflict. The war ends with the Treaty of Versailles, right? The problem here is, how do you create peace after this massive war? And there was pressure, right? There's two groups competing. Those who wanted to punish Germany, right? England, France, they wanted to punish Germany for the war. And those who wanted to focus on rebuilding and creating long-term peace. Think President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, coming back into the story, right? The U.S. has been on the sidelines with this course, but that's because this is a world history, not a U.S. history class. But punishment versus rebuilding the peace, two different goals that were in competition. The choice was, or it was then to give Germany very harsh terms for peace. The consequence was increased resentment in Germany, increased instability in the world. And so the idea here you need to take away is that bad solutions created future problems. Those problems we see play out with the rise of fascism in our next unit. Big through lines to keep in mind throughout this, and these are the kind of the most important things to know. Across all our topics, we see pressure building over time from multiple causes, right? Systems are creating unintended problems. Industrialization wasn't created to create inequality. That was an unintended consequence. Imperialism wasn't designed to create competition between empires, but that was an unintended consequence. Attempts to create stability can often fail, like we saw with the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, or as we will see with the Treaty of Versailles leading to World War II. And again, conflict is not a simple this, then that. There are multiple things that always come into play that create the conflict. And so let's try not to, in our written answers, oversimplify by focusing on just one cause of a conflict. Big common mistakes that I keep seeing over and over again in written responses is being too vague, right? Saying there were problems. Well, what were those problems specifically, and why were they problems? Or people using only one example. Remember, multiple things lead to conflict, not one. A lot of people are still confusing cause and effect, right? Cause, right? This is what led something to happen. Effect, what happened because of the thing. And then not explaining why it matters, right? Just, it's not enough to say this thing happened. You have to tell me why it's important that that thing happened. What impact did it have on the world, on the areas that we're studying? And the final check here, if you can explain how Napoleon's empire rose and fell, the problems and responses to the Industrial Revolution, why the imperialism happened and the effects of imperialism, if you can explain what caused World War I and what the ultimate trigger to it was, and you can explain why the Treaty of Versailles failed, you're probably ready for this test. I'm not saying you're going to ace it, but I'm going to say you're probably ready to pass the test if you can do these things. If you want to ace it, I really recommend going to that study guide I produced for you. Go to the review extra credit worksheet that I've created for you. Remember, the games are great for kind of reviewing, but not for learning. I really recommend, first and foremost, the review worksheet, this study guide, as I said. Go back and watch the note videos. Go back and look at the readings again. And then, as a last thing to do to prepare, play the review games. All right, hopefully this helps. And now I believe we're going to get to the games. So have at it, and goodbye forever.